We have spent the last couple of years reporting with some degree of frequency about the decision by the Biden administration to indict a black socialist group, often called the Uhuru Movement, on charges that they were acting as Russian agents. Now, we've interviewed the lawyer for the defendants in that case. We've interviewed the defendants. We have had experts on. We've covered it at length. Very few other media outlets have covered it. One of the only ones that did during the actual indictment was Tucker Carlson, who put the head of this black socialist group on his program and has talked about this prosecution so much because it's so obviously an attempt to criminalize free speech, free political speech in the United States, particularly when it comes to dissenting against U.S. policy toward the war in Ukraine. These are not people who just out of nowhere started opposing the war in Ukraine as though it were inconsistent with their lifelong ideology because they were being paid by the Russian government. They weren't being paid by the Russian government. And they were advocating exactly what you would expect them to. There's all kinds of people that come out of the black radical left-wing movement in the United States, and they would never, ever dream of endorsing a NATO war in Europe against Russia. It would be inconceivable. That would be what would be suspicious, is if they actually supported that war. These are people come out of the 1960s tradition of people like Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey and people like that, and they have had as one of their primary leading views, the defining, shaping views of their group, the fact that militarism inside the United States, the military-industrial complex, endless war, imperialism are not only immoral and destructive in their own right, but deprive American citizens, and particularly poor people and black people, which is what they focus on inside the United States as well. And yet the States government saw them advocating against the war in Ukraine. It's a tiny little group. Most people have not even heard of this group. I hadn't before I started covering this case, so it's not like they're having some huge effect on internal and domestic opinion in the United States. And they were able to find very trivial transactions between people in Moscow who never told this group they were with the Russian government, who the U.S. government alleges had a connection to the Russian government, talking about $1,000 here, $700 here for an event, for some sort of ad. And just based on that alone, they brought a federal indictment full of felony charges, accusing them of being undeclared Russian agents, criminally spreading propaganda inside the United States on behalf of a foreign government. Talking about two of the defendants were 81 years old, which is the leader of the group, another who is 79 years old, who have spent their entire life doing things like this. So we've been covering the criminal proceeding as it has evolved. And then earlier this week in Tampa, the trial concluded, and then a jury returned a verdict where they acquitted all four of the defendants on the most serious charge, which was acting as an agent of the Russian government to spread pro-Russian propaganda inside the United States, but it did convict them on a charge of conspiracy, conspiring to act with Russian agents, which I presume means that they thought about doing it, they talked about doing it, but they never actually became Russian agents. But even the attempt to become one was somehow itself a crime. But it's a much less serious crime. The jury did not find that they were Russian agents. That's the crux of the case. Here's the New York Times version of events. The headline was, "Activists convicted of conspiring to act as Russian agents." Quote, "The four defendants were acquitted of the more serious charge of failing to register as Russian agents. The case in Florida offered a window into Russian influence operations. Quote, an unusual federal trial detailing the inner workings of a Russian influence operation in the United States ended on Thursday with jurors convicting four members of a black power group of conspiring to act as agents of the Russian government. The defendants were acquitted of failing to register as Russian agents, a more serious charge." So there's really no coherence in this jury verdict. The defendants already said we're going to appeal it, but of course they're celebrating the fact that the jury did not find that they ever acted as Russian agents. And the only charge on which they were convicted, this conspiracy charge, though theoretically providing up to 5 years in prison, is very unlikely to provide anywhere near that. The New York Times article goes on, quote, "Prosecutors had argued during the week-long trial in Tampa that the defendants had engaged in a 7-year conspiracy to sow division in American politics. I had always thought the purpose of the free speech clause and a free press was to create division by challenging things that the government was saying, by convincing people that government leaders were corrupt or lying or acting with ill motives. A unified, homogenized country, by definition, can never be free. Quote, the defendants countered that the government was trying to criminalize their support of Russian ideology, which they argued was protected political speech. Speaking after the verdict on Thursday, 3 of the defendants and their lawyers said they considered the acquittal on the more serious charge to be a victory. They also vowed to appeal the conviction on the lesser charges. Quote, the most important thing is they were unable to convict us of working for anybody except black people, said Amali Yeshitela, the chairman of the Uhuru movement, said on the courthouse steps, according to the Tampa Bay Times. That's the leader of this group that I interviewed, that Tucker Carlson interviewed, several other people have. Nowhere near enough, given how sinister in this case is and how it's intended to chill the exercise of free speech. He added, quote, but I am willing to be charged and found guilty of working for black people. The Uhuru movement is the activist arm of the American People's Socialist Party, an organization promoting black power. The groups are based in San Francisco, Florida, and St. Louis. For decades, the Uhuru movement has protested issues like racism, colonialism, and policing. When the Justice Department indicted these 4 individuals as part of this black radical left-wing group for the crime of opposing the war in Ukraine, the Department of Justice, it was in April of 2023, posted this press release about what they were doing. Quote, U.S. citizens and Russian intelligence officers charged with conspiring to use U.S. citizens as illegal agents of the Russian government. Quote, a federal grand jury in Tampa returned a superseding indictment charging 4 U.S. citizens and 3 Russian nationals with working on behalf of the Russian government and in conjunction with the Russian Federal Security Services, FSB, to conduct a multi-year foreign malign influence campaign in the United States. That's the charge on which they were just acquitted. Among other conduct, the superseding indictment alleges that the Russian defendants recruited, funded, and directed U.S. political groups to act as unregistered illegal agents of the Russian government and sow discord and spread pro-Russian propaganda. The indicted intelligence officers in particular participated in covertly funding and directing candidates for local office within the United States. Additionally, in a separate case out of the District of Columbia, a criminal complaint was unsealed charging Russian national Natalia Berlinova with conspiring with an FSB officer to act as an illegal agent of Russia in the United States. Quote, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service allegedly weaponized our First Amendment rights. Freedoms Russia denies its own citizens to divide Americans and interfere in elections in the United States, said Assistant Attorney General Matthew G. Olson of the Justice Department's National Security Division. Quote, the department will not hesitate to expose and prosecute those who sow discord and corrupt U.S. elections in service of hostile foreign interests, regardless of whether the culprits are U.S. citizens or foreign individuals abroad. Now, we covered the case where there was an indictment unsealed last week by the Justice Department where they accused a company of posing as an American company in order to pay several right-wing influencers such as Tim Pool and Dave Rubin and Benny Johnson, who worked for this organization called Tenet Media. They apparently were paid a lot of money. The indictment itself says that they had no idea that they were actually getting paid by anyone connected with the Russian government. And so there's no indictment possible of them, nor of presumably Tenet Media. The people who were indicted were the people with RT and other people who had organized this, engineered this system. But everything about this, of course, as we're approaching the 2024 election, is all about rejuvenating this narrative about Russia interfering in our sacred democracy and in our election. It's what they did in 2016. It's what they did in 2020, right before the election then, when they called the Hunter Biden reporting this on the Hunter Biden laptop Russian disinformation. It's obviously no coincidence that right before the election, the Biden Justice Department is trying to scare everybody about Russian influence again. One of the few programs that covered it, surprisingly actually, this indictment was Democracy Now! In June of 2023, because usually that show is fanatically embracing of Russiagate and all of the Russia paranoia. They interviewed, I believe, the leader of the group or one of the defendants, Yeah, the leader of the group, the same person we interviewed who was a defendant, and here's what he said.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Well, the federal indictment of Donald Trump is making headlines around the world today. We end the show looking at another federal indictment that's received little press attention. In April, the Biden administration charged 4 U.S. citizens from a Pan-Africanist group with conspiring with the Russian government to sow discord in U.S. elections. Amali Yeshitela, chair of the African People's Socialist Party, faces charges of conspiracy to defraud the United States, along with Penny Hess, Jesse Neville, and Augustus Romain Jr. 3 Russians were also named in an indictment unsealed by the Justice Department. This follows a violent FBI raid on the activist properties in Missouri and Florida last summer. African People's Socialist Party has been a longtime advocate for reparations for slavery, a vocal critic of U.S. foreign policy. Amali Yeshitela joins us now, chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, located in St. Louis, Missouri. Amali, thanks for joining us again. We spoke to you after the FBI raid on your house in St. Louis. If you can now talk about the indictment, your response to what the government is alleging.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I want to say we have to stop meeting like this. I think the first time we met was after the government attacked our Uhuru House in St. Petersburg, Florida in 1996, 300 strong. And then we've talked subsequent to that, the July 29th attack on the Uhuru House in St. Petersburg, Florida, and as you mentioned, my home in St. Louis, Missouri, as well as offices and homes of our party members in 2 states, St. Louis and in St. Petersburg, Florida. So, as you mentioned, the indictment happened after something like 9 months after we were characterized as unindicted co-conspirators in some plot with the Russians, who it is said that we served in fighting around the questions of reparations and fighting to bring the United States before the United Nations for the crime of genocide against African people, and for our differences with the United States in terms of the Ukraine war.
I mean, you can just take one look at this guy and just listen to what he says, and you know exactly what he is. This is what he's been doing his whole life. He's a political activist on behalf of this left-wing ideology. Obviously, it doesn't matter if you agree with it or not. It doesn't make the slightest difference. He considers himself a Black Power advocate, as I said, that comes out of the sort of Black Panther movement of the 1960s and Malcolm X and those kind of teachings. And all of those black left-wing activists, Black Power activists and the like in the 1960s were vehemently opposed to the American war machine because they were shaped by the Vietnam War. And even Martin Luther King got around in 1968 or 1967, actually, the year before he was murdered, 1 year to the date before he was murdered, when he spoke at Riverside Church, and he apologized and he said, for a long time I thought that all I could do was focus on racism and racial inequality and civil rights here in the United States, but I've come to realize, and he said too late, but I have come to realize that there can be no domestic progress until the war machine and imperialism are reined in and we stop endless war, because until we do that, we're going to be a country that just pours all of its resources into arms manufacturers that's devoted to destroying people, to extinguishing populations, and not to improving the lives of our citizens at home. And that's what this group is all about. They also advocate reparations, and they have always been opposed to the U.S. government's foreign policy. You wind them up, and they are opposed to the U.S. foreign policy. Foreign policies with the idea that they needed Russian money, or that they only started sowing discord. These are radicals. That's what they do. They sow discord. That's their purpose. That's what they're trying to do. That's what they've always been doing. Because you find a very trivial connection with people in Moscow who you claim are somehow connected to the Russian government or Russian intelligence, and then you charge them as Russian agents. Just gives you a sense of how extreme the U.S. government has become when it comes to anything regarding Russia. And again, I think the idea here is to signal to other people, look, if you think about sowing discord in the United States. If you think about challenging our foreign policy with respect to Russia, or really, if you agitate for any kind of policy that we regard as destabilizing, and we can find even a tiny amount of money where you were connected to somebody we can claim was part of a foreign government, we're going to indict you as being foreign agents of that government. And that, as I said, is the charge on which they were acquitted. We interviewed the leader, Mali Yashtala, back in February of this year, and here's part of what he told us. In cases like the one that you're currently involved in, where the question is somebody acting as an agent of a foreign government? Typically, when I think of someone who's acting as an agent of a foreign government, that to me is somebody who's like a lobbyist, somebody who's saying things that they don't believe because they're being paid to say them or to work on behalf of a foreign government. In this case, in the case of your advocacy against U.S. involvement in Ukraine, or even your advocacy where you end up siding on the side of Russia in certain controversies, do you see that as consistent with the activism and ideology that you've been pursuing and defending for decades?
It's very much consistent with it. The fact is that that it's very disingenuous for the United States government to charge us of not having agency, that we're working on behalf of a foreign government. The fact is that I was in Belfast, Ireland in 1983, and working in solidarity with the Irish people in opposition to British colonialism. I was in Nicaragua at the time of the Reagan inauguration in opposition to U.S. in solidarity with the people of Nicaragua, who had just won their freedom despite the policies of the United States government. In fact, it was a time of extreme turmoil that even changed some policies of the United States government in terms of how it would characterize people like me who were talking about freedom, and had determined that people who were engaged in struggles like in Nicaragua and El Salvador that had emerged would no longer it wouldn't be tolerated in terms of calling them freedom fighters. They would be characterized as terrorists. And so I was in Spain, invited to speak in Spain by an NGO that was supported by the Spanish government. I was there in 2007. And when I spoke there, I spoke also in opposition to U.S. policies that were impacting on peoples around the world. I was invited to speak at Oxford Union, and I spoke there in 2019. And I opened my presentation in 2019 expressing solidarity with the government of Venezuela that at the time was being challenged by United States policy as well. So this is historically what we've been about. And so this whole notion that somehow we become an employee of Russia because I visited Moscow and got marching orders, from Moscow at that point. That's been responsible for the fact that we ran and participated in elections, not gun battles, but elections. Participating in elections in St. Petersburg, Florida, for mayor, for city council, 2017, 2019. We ran candidates on reparations and things like that. That suddenly we are learning is a consequence of a relationship to Russia, and not due to the agency of black people. And even the whole nonsense about Russia hiring us to talk about genocide. I mean, we held a convention, a tribunal on reparations for black people in the United States in 1982 in New York City, and used international law as a basis for that. And one of those laws was the UN Convention on the punishment and on the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide. So it's disingenuous. There's nothing that we're doing now that we haven't been doing for the last 50 years.
Yeah, I remember when Tucker Carlson interviewed him, and he put him on his primetime Fox show. He told his Fox audience, hey, I want you to hear from this 82-year-old black leftist radical, because he's just been indicted on these unbelievably dubious charges as a Russian agent, criminally acting on behalf of Russia. I remember Tucker saying on there that, you know what, I'm sure I don't agree with this guy much, but actually come to think of it, I'd probably really love to have dinner with him. And maybe we actually do agree on more than I would suspect. And I think the reason why Tucker found this case so enraging and therefore appealing to cover was because, as I said, you just listen to this guy speak. And you just, it's so easily recognizable what he is. He was in Nicaragua in the 80s. He was, traveling the world on behalf of left-wing causes, protesting American imperialism and militarism his entire life. He's 2 or 3 years older than Joe Biden. He's 81 or 82 years old. So actually maybe a year older than Joe Biden. I think he's 82 now, which imagine Joe Biden speaking this coherently in such a focused way for so long about pretty complex issues. Congratulations to him on that. But I think what makes this so offensive, just, as he said, was, this is what I've been doing my whole life. This is what my whole life is about. Now suddenly, the only reason why I'm talking about reparations or opposing NATO imperialism is because the Russians ordered me to. I'm an agent of the Russian government. I have to take marching orders from Russia. He's been doing all of this through the 70s, through the 80s, at the height of the Cold War, through the Nixon administration, the Ford administration, Jimmy Carter, the Reagan administration, and Bush, and Clinton, and Bush and Cheney. And he was fine. And now we suddenly arrive at this moment in our history where we're even more obsessed with and fanatical about Russia than we were at the height of the Cold War, as we're about to show you. And suddenly at the age of 82 or however old he is, he gets charged with suddenly acting as an agent of the Russian government because he's sowing discord inside the United States. All right, let's listen to the rest of this. You can go back decades, of course.
Crime of genocide. So it's disingenuous. There's nothing that we're doing now that we haven't been doing for the last 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's so bizarre, you can go back decades, of course, to the Cold War, and it found its most disgraceful expression in the McCarthy era, where the U.S. government, the U.S. security state, would routinely accuse American citizens who dissented from the war policies of the U.S. government, of being somehow in cahoots with the Kremlin, or disloyal, or an agent of the Kremlin. And it's really bizarre to watch that be rejuvenated, even after the ideology of Russia has changed so radically, albeit often by the Democratic Party, the kind of neoliberal order. Just this week, we saw a suggestion from Nancy Pelosi that anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian protesters might be somehow connected to the Kremlin, and they ought to be investigated. This kind of paranoia that we hadn't seen for decades. So, to me, that's the point. Now, in addition to interviewing the chairman of the movement, we also interviewed their lawyer to talk about some of the legal aspects of this case. And I think the beyond the legal issue, and we're going to show you what the lawyer said because I think it's so important, especially given this acquittal, is the kind of discourse and cultural reflex this demonstrates. It has become almost reflexive in the discourse of American liberalism to just anytime you hear anyone challenging your party, challenging your leaders, challenging your ideology, opposing the politicians that you follow, to just instantly accuse people of being a paid agent of the Russian government, of being a Kremlin asset. We've shown you so many times how often that's happened to so many people. Remember when Hillary Clinton accused Tulsi Gabbard of that for daring to run against her in 2016? And how everybody who had any kind of prominent platform who opposed the NATO war in Ukraine was put on an official list of the Ukrainian intelligence agency accusing us of being Russian propagandists. I know I ended up on 4 or 5 of those official lists, at least myself. But just in general, that's just now baked in to the way Democrats and liberals think about the world, which is so ironic, because in the sort of left liberal civil libertarianism in which I was raised, that kind of formulated my very initial views when I was much younger, the McCarthy era was considered to be, after, say, the internment of Japanese Americans, probably, and you can go back to the 1917 Espionage Act, but certainly one of the top worst infringements of free speech rights, of free thought thinking rights, of civil liberties, because it wasn't that there were no communists in the government. There were. The point was that Joseph McCarthy routinely accused people of being Russian agents because of their political views without the slightest evidence, and ruined their lives with ease all the time. He constantly carried around a briefcase in which he claimed that the evidence proving they were Russian agents was in his briefcase, but he could never show it. These people were never charged with crimes. They weren't convicted, but they had their lives ruined, their reputations destroyed. They ended up blacklisted because everyone was petrified of working with them once Joseph McCarthy branded them a Russian agent. And of course, most of the people whom he targeted were in the Democratic Party, were on the left wing, or the left liberal flank of the Democratic Party. And that was why in 2016, when I watched Democrats and liberals embrace the same exact script and now 8 years later do it, well, certainly longer than McCarthy was able to do it, and with a lot more fervor, just everybody is a Russian agent. Here's people who want reparations and who went to Moscow and opposed the war in Ukraine. Let's put them in jail as Russian agents. It is not only embedded in the culture now, but also in the law. So here's the interview we did with Leonard Goodman, who is the lawyer who represented these 4 defendants, or I think 3 out of the 4. And he talks here about the legal components of this case.
I could just mention one other thing
Absolutely.
About the indictment, that, it also charges that there's spreading Russian propaganda and disinformation. So that seems to completely contradict the finding that this is content neutral, this has nothing to do with speech. And the one interesting thing is in the motion to dismiss, we cited we looked at their speeches and cited articles by Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs that say the exact same thing in different ways, but basically the exact same thing about the United States involvement in Ukraine, which is something that's named in the indictment, that our advocacy or our complaint that the United States was involved in provoking this war. So we cited those articles, and the government's response was to say that, well, when we say disinformation, that doesn't mean it's not true. It could still be true, but it's basically Russian tradecraft, and they intend to call experts to say, basically Russia experts, to say that even though it's truthful information, it still benefits Russia, and we're still doing Russia's bidding. So it's quite bizarre. It's almost Alice in Wonderland to basically say disinformation. If you look it up, it means false information, but not according to the government in this case.
Well, that's why I think this case is worth so much attention, because that is becoming one of the most pervasive tactics. Of course, this word disinformation is being used to censor the internet. And what it's really being used to do above all else is criminalize dissent. Exactly as you said, the minute you oppose U.S. involvement in the war in Ukraine, which obviously advances the interests of the Russian government, regardless of whether or not that's your intent, they regard you automatically as a Russian propagandist. And if there's anyone who believes that this prosecution would have been brought if this party had, instead of opposing U.S. support for Ukraine, opposed U.S. support for Ukraine, been cheering for U.S. support for Ukraine, I can't imagine the level of naivete and or dishonesty necessary to believe that. I mean, this is just a theme that is actually pervading so many things that happen. Just last night, we covered the Australian government's intention to start imposing massive fines on big tech companies if they don't remove what the government considers to be disinformation, and to do it in advance. This is everything that governments dislike, that Western governments dislike, is now deemed disinformation. Increasingly, it's becoming criminalized, and already it's something that cannot exist on the internet. That's why X no longer exists in Brazil, because things that a single Brazilian judge called disinformation or fake news wasn't immediately taken down, and that's considered a crime. And this is the framework that is pervading now not just our rhetoric and discourse the way it was in 2016 through 2018, 2019, with Russiagate being the obsessive focus, but also increasingly the law, and not just the law in the West, but the law here in the United States. So I'm glad this group and the defendants who stood trial were acquitted of the main charge. And I should add that last week, Jill Stein went to, the Green Party candidate, went to this trial and spoke up in defense of this group and denounced the prosecution as an attack on free speech. And of course, she was instantly accused by leading Democrats of cavorting with Russian agents, even though they hadn't even been convicted of that crime and have now have been acquitted of it. So it's in the DNA now of the Democratic Party, the liberal establishment, but also increasingly the laws and regulation of online speech throughout the West. So we'll probably have hopefully one of those defendants on next week, but I'm sure we'll have the lawyer on to talk about what this verdict exactly was and where they go from here. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.